What's up, Inquirers? Today's episode is a Patreon exclusive Point 5 Unlocked, so I hope you enjoy. What is up, Inquirers, and welcome to the Beyond/Point 5 of the recent episode with Seth Vandebrooke. And if anybody isn't familiar with who he is or what he does, I don't know why you guys are listening to the Point 5 episode without listening to the main episode. So you guys might as well go back and listen to that. But as far as this conversation goes, I know that there's some stuff that's been on Seth's mind that he kind of wants to get into. So I'll kind of let him lead the way into it, and we'll kind of see where it ends up going.
All right. Yeah. I wanted to start off with just a question of like what some of your thoughts were with a bunch of the stuff we went over. Cause I don't know what all you know and what you've heard, and cause you get a whole podcast, right? You got a bunch of people coming on. And I was kind of curious, like what were your kind of summary thoughts from like the stuff that we read and talked about just now?
As far as like summary thoughts and stuff go, I mean, it's one of those things, like I was saying a little bit earlier, that it's like nothing new under the sun, that a lot of the time people are thinking that they're coming up with these new concepts, new ideas, especially with the whole like reemergence of people talking about Nephilim, the whole concept and where they came from and everything. And everybody was talking about how like clever it was that it kind of fits in with like the pantheons. And I'm glad that with the episode, you're able to kind of connect it back with some of this older text, because as far as I'm concerned, like the older text that's, maybe only a couple generations away from like the original quote events or whatever's going on, like those are the people that you really got to pay attention to. And I know that there's some hard differentiation as far as like when you start converting some of these old languages to modern day English, but once you put something together like you did, where it's these constant things you're seeing through multiple people's writing that can't really be perceived any other way, especially when you're viewing them all together, it lays down a pretty good groundwork for the fact that they had a good understanding of what Nephilim were. And it's almost like we're rediscovering it now, because for whatever reason, it just disappeared from the construct for a long time. I mean, even simply talking about the ideas of fallen angels or Nephilim wasn't even really something that was too recently talked. I mean, even in a lot of churches, it's still something that's not really talked about. It's only like with these specific sects that are really trying to understand the spiritual warfare. And I mean, as far as I'm concerned, man, like if you're a church and you're not teaching people how to defend themselves in spiritual warfare, I mean, you're not doing just as a church. You got to teach people how to protect themselves, and part of that is not letting people become part of the dark, but you have to be aware of it in order to navigate it and to protect yourself from it. So as much as you don't want to talk about these quote darker concepts according to the church, like it's a needed necessity.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that I think at one point I actually did, like, you can write a list of reasons why these topics are actually beneficial to talk about. Understanding the spiritual realm, understanding the enemy in general, right? Jesus literally told us, he was like, hey, be as wise as a serpent and as innocent as a dove, because I send you as sheep out amongst the wolves. It's like, hey, you're going out there as a sheep, right? Into a more or less a pack of wolves. Like that's the world, right? You need to be as wise as a serpent. And we really emphasize innocent as a dove, which is good. But why aren't we also emphasizing what he started with, which was be as wise as the serpent, right? And the first introduction we get to the serpent in Genesis chapter 3 is he was the most clever, right? He was a wise figure. And so it's like, hey, look, you're dealing with a wise enemy. You need to be wise too. You need to know what's going on. You need to know your enemy.
It's kind of like this old samurai expression that it's better to be a samurai in a garden than a gardener on a battlefield.
A gardener, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I agree, and I agree with the first point you're making too about it's interesting that we're the ones who have lost the context. That this people understood what the Nephilim were for a long time, but even all the way back to Genesis 6 when it first mentions the Nephilim. It literally says, like, the men of old, the men of renown. Like, that means everybody knew about them. So the first time we're introduced to the concept, the Bible's like, no need to expound on this because obviously everybody knows about it. And so it's us that are the ones that are like, well, what are we talking about? What do you mean? Like, we don't have that context. For thousands of years, everybody knew what they were talking about when this topic came up, right? And that's what I found with pretty much not everything, right? But like almost everything that I come across is strange or interesting. It's like, hold on, people have always known about this. Where did it go? And it's like almost always the answer is the Enlightenment. Enlightenment kicks in, and before you know it, poof, away goes all forms of history. Now it's mythology. It's not history anymore.
But ironically, the Bible itself never became something that people viewed as mythology. So it's weird that other writings from around the same time, from other people that were living through these times, you don't want to consider those, but you're, obviously taking the Bible into consideration. It just seems like you're kind of contradicting yourself within that thought.
Yes and no, right? Like like what you said is true in some circles, but also there are many, certainly today, that would say, oh, well, the Bible is just a mythological text. And so the Enlightenment did bring that idea that like, oh, well, that's all that is as well. Especially when with Darwin and all that, right? Because that was part of the Enlightenment. It was like, I don't know, mid or towards the end. I don't know. You could argue exactly when like the Enlightenment age ended there, but yeah, that was all kind of part of it.
Scientific Enlightenment, quote, so to speak, where you try to rationalize everything through science and completely try to throw religion out of the equation.
Right. I was just talking to a friend of mine today, who we were. Oh, I remember now. I was actually an intern at our church. And he was asking me all these questions. We were talking about Dogman and UFOs and pagan gods and all that stuff. It was just wild conversation. And we were talking about like, when did those things shift? And we were talking about this concept of the Enlightenment and everything, and how that was kind of the death of mythology and all that. But what I brought up is that recently I found this writing. I forget the title. It's a weird title, but it's all about how monkeys and orangutans are the most plausible scientific explanation for satyrs, dogman, and pygmies. And basically this, as far as I can tell, so far is the first text that I found. It's 1699. And it was this proposal to, I forget which Queen Elizabeth that was, but whoever that Queen Elizabeth was in that time. And the proposal was, to the whole academic community of like, hey guys, all these mythical creatures, like they weren't a thing. They just confused monkeys. And they used it for all of those, like pygmies, satyrs, and the Cynocephaly, and it brings up others as well. I was like, nah, these were probably just monkeys, and they got them confused. And it's this long, book or paper, whatever you want to refer to it as, making this argument. And to this day, that's what scholars say. They use that argument. They say, oh, no. Like all those creatures, those are just monkeys. People misidentified them. Like, really? Because they had words for monkeys. They knew what monkeys were. So what are we talking about? Like, they have this unique word that linguistically specifically means like this type of creature, and they knew what a monkey was. And you're telling me that they confused the two? Like,
I still, to this day, have not seen a monkey that's naked on the top half and has little horns. I mean, that seems like a really hard distinguishing thing to mess up as far as like a monkey
what
goes.
Are we talking? Yeah, like what are we talking about? Like it's, yeah, and it's funny because here we are laughing about how silly that sounds when, of course, people are laughing at us, going like,
"You guys
think those things exist?" Yeah. I acknowledge the irony there, but yeah, all I'd say, it's interesting, right? Seeing things shift. At that time period, but
that's something that pops up with Sasquatch a lot too. Just to make another comparison, that all of these hunters that spend hours and hours and hours and hours out in the woods, they have an experience with this thing that they can't explain. They don't call it a bear. They don't call it anything else. They refer to it. They don't even want to call it like a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch. And then everybody wants to go, no, you saw a bear. Like, if anybody in the entire world would know what a bear looks like, it's going to be this guy. And you're going to tell him he saw a bear, and you know what you're talking about more than him, who's spent hours and hours out there. It's the same thing you see with this, man. You see these people that are actually seeing these things, and you're trying to tell them what they saw, even though you didn't see it. Like, that logic doesn't make sense there, my friend.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's like, I've said this before in other podcasts, but it's so important that all of us just work on having grace for each other, right? And recognizing it like, hey, look, I don't know what you saw. I can't tell you what you saw, right? Here's what I think makes sense to me, and leave it at that. Like, that could be your stance. You're like, yeah, no, I think a bear makes more sense. that's fine, but you don't need to get all over the guy. You know, you can just be like, okay, like I disagree. I think it's something else. But people, they get wild about it, right? And sometimes pretty vicious. And it's like, no, you're wrong. It's a bear. Like, dude, okay, like, but calm down. Like, it doesn't need. You don't need to freak out about this. Like, you can state your stance calmly, and we can disagree calmly. But I'm not one to tell somebody you did or didn't see Dogman in the forest. Like, I don't know. I'm not going to pretend like I know something I don't know. You know.
That seems like a really hard thing to mess up in a lot of forests that people would have those encounters in. Like, there's not anything else out there that really has that, like, physique, you know what I mean? Like, even in some of these Sasquatch areas, it's like some of the bears they have there are, like, black bears and stuff like that. They're not big bears that are, like, 8-9 feet tall like people are describing. Like, you got to look at the comparison again. It's like, it doesn't make sense if you're really looking at the finite details. But, again, you want to tell somebody what they saw even though you weren't there. Same with a lot of these old texts. You want to tell people what they saw, even though you weren't there. And some of these people, you know, of course, are doing secondhand encounters and kind of talking about other things that other people saw. And with a lot of like the medieval stuff, you kind of see these weird interpretations of animals from somebody's description being translated to another place. But then you got people like Marco Polo that are literally talking about interacting, like seeing these things. And it's like, you're going to tell that guy who's explored the entire world, who's seen all of these different things, that he mixed something up, that he didn't see something new that he's never seen before, even though he was a world explorer.
Well, I said this last time we talked, but what always gets me with that is the fact that, you know, part of the way we tell that story is we're like, oh, those silly people who didn't believe him when he described gorillas or whatever. But then he describes Dogman and we're like, oh, well, he's crazy there. And you're like, you're doing the exact same thing. Like the exact same thing that you're mocking everybody else for. Where it's like, why didn't you believe him? Obviously, those monkeys and those animals exist, you know, giraffes or whatever. Like, I forget which animals, but there's like a list of animals that he mentions that everyone was like, oh, that's crazy. Those things don't exist. Today we know they exist. We have them in our zoos, except for Dogman. So we're like, oh, well, then that's made up. Like, dude, that's like, come on. The hypocrisy is crazy, right?
The rationalization gets more ridiculous than the actual event itself. And you see this a lot with even like other cryptid stuff or like UFO stuff with like it was ball gas. Like, that's extremely rare all on its own. We had one where we covered the Grafton Monster recently, and this guy had this sighting where, you know, he saw this big thing on the side of the road, and one of the explanations that somebody said was, oh, it must have been a polar bear. Like, yeah, because that makes sense that a polar bear is in the middle of West Virginia. And then the other explanation was, oh, it must have been some lady pulling a fridge down the street. Like, okay, like your logical explanation seems way more irrational than somebody just saw something weird. Like a woman dragging a fridge down the street, just nonchalant. Yeah, that makes sense. And then a polar bear being in West Virginia. Yeah, that also makes sense.
And that's where, you know, with all the things we're talking about, right? Whether it's, you know, Dogman existing, whether it's, you know, all the things you just mentioned as well. It's like, again, can we just say, hey, I think this makes sense and leave it at that? Like, but when we jump to those conclusions and we're like, no, it can't be what you said because I don't think what you makes sense. Ergo, it's wrong. It's like, no, that's not how logic works. It's not how evidence works. Like, you can make a claim too, right? You can say, I think it was a woman dragging the fridge. But then you need to have some form of evidence for your thing that makes so much more sense, right? But it's like, you can make a claim, but you can just tell a story. Like, how is that better than just completely making something up? Even if it's more plausible, it doesn't mean that it's true. Like, you do actually have to have some form of evidence. And that's the thing with, you know, I'll talk with people about this kind of hypothetically. You know, if I were to tell you that, you know, purple unicorn cows existed, that would sound crazy. I don't think they exist. But if I were to make an argument, if I said that, like, I'd have to provide some kind of evidence, right? But if I say, oh, you know, I saw a car with red paint and a strange tattoo design spray painted on the side, you'd be like, okay, sure, probably, because that's pretty plausible. Like, it's not that crazy. But neither of those things are more true. They're both made up, right? And yet, that's not how we treat stories. We go, oh, well, that one's true because it made more sense, and that one's not true because it didn't make sense. And when you say those words, everyone's obviously like, well, obviously that's not how you should treat things. But that is how you're treating it when you say the things we're talking about right now. Like, that's what you're doing. You're like, no, it was probably this, not probably, because they're not saying probably. It was this. Like, this is what it was. it was this ball of gas, or it was that, or whatever. It's like, okay, do you have any evidence? No. Okay, then your story is no better. Like, if you're going to provide an alternative, give me something to work with. And that's, that's what I'm doing with the Dogman stuff, right? It's like, you can tell me that Dogman's relatively blue in the face, but like, can you give me some kind of evidence? And that's what I'm doing on podcasts. I'm like, hey, look, here's a stupid amount of evidence. Like, it's dumb how many documents can be found. It's dumb how many like archaeological artifacts exist. It's whether it's stone sculptures or cave paintings that date back thousands of years, or hieroglyphics or whatever, right? Like, no, there is. That's the difference. It's like, well, why does Dogman make any sense? I'm not saying they for sure exist. I'm saying in terms of, what historians refer to as verisimilitude, it's pretty high on that scale of more likely because of the overwhelming amount of evidence. And that's what got me into it in the first place. I was fascinated. I was like, wait, why is there so much evidence for something that's that out there, But that's, I wish more people treated things that way and were able to just have an open mind, be able to objectively be like, okay, I'll entertain your thought. What's your evidence? Dude, if conversations went like that, the world would be a better place. If it was like, okay, I'm open, like, tell me what your evidence is. And that conversations go so much better that way. Because, either they're making up and they're like, oh, I don't have any evidence. Or they're like, no, I'm not making up. I just don't have any evidence. And you're like, okay, well, we can't really go anywhere from here. Like, I'll either believe you or I won't. But, there can't really be an investigation if we don't have something to work with. And then you're able to just leave it at that. Like, okay, cool story. Maybe it happened. Maybe it didn't. And we can be okay with that. But yeah, anyways, this is just me dreaming of, what the world could be like if people were more forgiving in their conversations and a little bit more balance in terms of investigation into the strange stuff in the world.
Ain't that the truth? Hold on tight, guys. We'll be right back after this brief commercial break. And now back to the show. I mean, even when you're talking about like the whole like Dogman or just different types of beings in general, I mean, you see this play out anyways, that if there's a group that's different, you see this thing that'll happen where it's like a genocide of that group. I mean, you see reference to this even with like, the Native Americans with Lovelock Cave getting rid of these, quote, giant beings. Mm-hmm. Like if there is some type of group that is different than the rest of the group, like there is going to be an effort to try to get rid of that group for whatever reason, be it out of fear, be it out of them being different or different supplies. So considering the time and place that all of these beings were being referenced in, considering how almost every point of the world was at war to like some extent, like it doesn't seem that far off to me to think that it is possible that these things existed at some point and may not now, or not nearly in as much numbers that people are able to document these things. Because again, if they were something different, as humans, we know that that's what ends up naturally happening, is that they eventually end up getting rid of the thing that's different. So if you have an island like we were referencing with these dog-headed beings, eventually you get to a point where it's like, all right, these things are getting smarter. They're not too far behind us. Like, if we don't get rid of them now, they might end up being a bigger problem for us later on. And then once you wipe out the history of a civilization, especially back then, there's only scraps of documentation, but you're not getting it from the horse's mouth. So it instantly becomes, bits of folklore because the original society's documentation of themselves doesn't exist anymore. Because what happens when anybody raids any other society? They destroy all of their history, all of their background. So again, why would it be any different with these races?
Yeah. So, when you think of, we're just going down this rabbit trail, but when you think of the things that have been fossilized versus the things that haven't, the number of fossils to the number of creatures that existed is like the ratio is so tiny, right? Fossils are rare. But there are a couple of creatures we know exist only because of those fossils. Think of how easy it is to have creatures that existed that we just don't have fossils for. And do you have any idea how quickly bones deteriorate? It's way faster than you think, right? And so in reality, it is so overwhelmingly possible to have so many of thousands of different types of creatures that could have existed that are gone now, right? In just a, not even a far out there conspiracy theory, just a obvious mathematical probability and scientific understanding of reality. Highly likely there are tons of creatures that we have, because we're discovering new creatures, species that exist today. let alone like who knows what used to exist, right? So just acknowledging that and realizing that how many writings, how many documents, how many sculptures do we have of dodo birds? Not a lot. Barely anything at all. I personally don't know of any writings specifically that are ancient. Maybe there's some somewhere. I don't know of any, and I've read a lot of old stuff, right? Compare that to some of these creatures that we're talking about, where there are tons of writings, right? So you're like, come on. Yeah, like we know dodo birds exist because, well, we do have physical evidence and proof of them, but just because we don't for something else that we have way more writings about than dodo birds, you're like, well, why does one count more, right? And I do understand the argument that like, well, there's a difference between having a thing you can hold and having someone claim something. And I totally get that, right? That is true. There's also a huge difference between one person claiming something and having corroboration across thousands of years, across language, culture, and ethnicity, right? That's really hard to argue against. And so that's, that's the crux of a lot of stuff that we're talking about. It's like, okay, sure. You can make the claims that, well, because that's the thing that people go to when you have all this other type of evidence. Like, why? Well, where are the writings? Here are the writings. Well, where's the archaeological evidence? Here's the archaeological evidence. Well, where's the biological? Well, we don't have biological. Oh, then it's not real. Like, well, dude, come on. Like, what are you talking about? Like, because there's one type of evidence that you don't have, like that thing doesn't exist. Like, no. But one of the things I've enjoyed a lot with reading, old things as I do, aside from creatures, is actually a lot of just like the philosophical side of things. I enjoy that kind of stuff, especially when it overlaps with theological things. And one of the things that I'll bring up somewhat frequently are these writings that a lot of people talk about. Oh, have you read Republic by Plato? Right? Everyone's like, that's the book you read, right? But Plato wrote a lot of stuff, and one of the things that are, I guess you could argue, lesser known, are his writings Timaeus and Critias. Anyone who's gone down the rabbit trail of Atlantis would know Timaeus and Critias are his writings where he talks about Atlantis. Or at least, or someone else talks about Atlantis, that he records. And in that writing, there's a lot of other stuff too.
I think he got the description from an Egyptian priest, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
So he quotes Critias. Critias is the one who said it's his great whatever grandfather Solon, who we know existed, who, yes, got the story from Egyptian priests. I think it was the priests of Neith. I could be wrong. But yeah, so he gets that story from them. And that's such an interesting story. And there's so many misnomers about that. Maybe we can do an episode on that one day. But
I've been wanting to do a good solid Atlantis episode. So I'd definitely be down for that.
Okay. Well, we'll have to do that then for sure. Because it drives me crazy when I hear people going on podcasts and they're like, oh yeah, and this and that. And Plato said this. I'm like, no. Like, what are you quoting? That's not what he said at all. Or they're like, oh, this makes perfect sense because it lines up with these things. And I'm like, that completely disagree. Like, call it something else, right? Like, if you want to say Plato was wrong about 90% of what he said, but he was right about 10%, you're talking about a different city. Like, just call it a different, island or whatever. But that's my own pet peeve. But yeah, so yeah, maybe we could talk about that sometime. But in that writing, he quotes Timaeus, making this fascinating. For me, it was fascinating. And it's honestly changed the way I've thought about a lot of things. Where he talks about, he's like, hey, before we can get into Atlantis, and because this guy's dramatic, he was an astronomer. He was also like a politician, and he was a very, very smart guy, but
bit eccentric.
Mathematician. Yeah, for sure. And so Timaeus, he's like, well, before we can talk about Atlantis, we need to back all the way up to the beginning of the universe. Like, okay, that's dramatic, but he does. So he goes all the way back because why not?
Before I tell you about what I did yesterday, let me go back and tell you about my birth.
Literally. Yeah, it's like, oh, hi, nice to meet you. So where do you come from? Well, in 19, but it's like, but yeah, so he starts talking about the philosophical concept of two things. And he says it kind of like a riddle. So I'm giving you the simplified, Americanized paraphrase of the very long, riddle-sounding, poetic version of what he says. Where essentially he says, hey, there are two things that exist if you were to break things into two categories, right? You have that which is infinite and that which is finite. That which is infinite is by definition is unchanging, has no beginning and has no end. Part of the reason why it's unchanging is because there's no beginning and there's no end. There's also no middle. So it's like you just can't. You just are what you are. Like the thing is what it is, and that's kind of that's the definition, right, of an absolute truth. It's like it just is true. It doesn't matter what you say or do. There's no beginning or end to that truth either. So he starts with this category. There's that which is infinite, and then there's that which is finite, which is something that is not only can it. So that which is infinite is unchanging. Not only is it not unchanging, but it's never not changing. So it's always in a state of change. And it will have a beginning and a presumed end, right? Philosophically speaking, maybe not an end, maybe, but it'll always be changing. There's these two critical, and it's just a concept, right? That's just, logic alone. Those are two types of things that can exist, right? So he's like, okay, now that we have those definitions, let's play a game. And what he does is he's like, look around, let's observe the universe, see what's going on. Do you see change? Obvious big fat yes, right? So he's like, there's change everywhere. When we look at all this change, that means we live in a finite universe. What does that mean? It means there is a beginning. If there's a beginning, what caused the beginning, right? Basic Newtonian like physics stuff like that. Something has to cause this thing, right? What is the beginning of this thing? And naturally, simply logically, he's like, well, if everything that we see is in this finite universe, which has to be true because there's change, then only you can keep saying, well, what started that? What started that? So there has to be something that is of the infinite category that can start everything in the finite category, because nothing that is finite can exist before everything, right? Because by definition, that thing would have to have a beginning. So there has to be something that has no beginning and has no end and is unchanging. That could be the thing that would cause this finite universe to exist. Like, just logically speaking, there's no alternative to that, which I would agree with. Like, these are the two options you have. Something infinite has to start that finite thing. Otherwise, you just have to be playing the game of, okay, well, what started that? What started that? What started that? What started that? And ad infinitum. And then you're like, well, when's that first cause, right? At some point in time, you have to answer that. What was that first thing? So he simplifies all that. And it's just like, obviously, you have to have that last thing. And everyone's like, yes, of course. We know this. We're philosophers. We're Greek philosophers. We understand.
Inquiries of Our Reality will be right back after this brief commercial break, so stay tuned. And now back to the show.
So he keeps going. He's like, okay, so you have that. So he's like, so there's something that is infinite that created everything. And something singular, right? So he takes that and he says, okay, what can we learn about this mysterious infinite force that created everything? He's like, well, all we have that we can observe is what's in this finite universe. And he does this, to me, this next step is the more interesting thing. He's like, okay, well, what do we see? There is a lot of beauty in this universe. I'm like, yeah, for sure, right? He's like, look at the stars, look at everything. We're like, it's gorgeous. There's a lot of beauty. So, and then he uses the analogy of like a painter always uses a model of the thing he's painting, creating. Basically, you can't create something you don't know or can't conceptualize.
You need the inspiration, right? Like the spark.
Yes. And so he's like, where are you getting it from? Whatever created us would have to already have the concept of beauty and would have to create, because nothing exists other than him, right? Because this is before creation, in order to have the idea to create the creation. Well, at that point in time, you're the only thing that exists. You're the only infinite singular source. So what are you going to base everything off of? You're the only thing that's there. So he's like, okay, so that means that this infinite source must be a infinite source of beauty. Like, there must be beauty. Where else would you get the idea of beauty? Like, where else would you get the concept? What else, right? So there must be this sense of beauty and creativity and all these things that we see in the universe. And because that beauty existed before anything that was finite, it too would be infinite. So you have this God, this creator that is infinitely beautiful and poured that beauty into creation. And then he acknowledges another philosophical note where he says that act of, instead of selfishly or jealously keeping that beauty to itself, by instead sharing that, bestowing it upon creation, and as something for people like us to then appreciate, that anti-jealousy act, that anti-selfishness act, is clearly then an act of love, right? So it's like, so then that means that this God is also loving, beautiful and loving in infinite form, because again, this love existed before anything else. So he starts this foundation and then he builds off of that and literally starts referring to him as our Father and the Maker. I'm like, dude, are we talking about the God of the Bible? Like, you're using all my like Christian terminology right now, and you're a Greek philosopher, right? I was blown away. I was like, what am I reading right now? I thought the Greeks only believed in like a pantheon of gods. What he does is then says that creator created the gods and everything else. I'm like, yeah, actually, that's what the Bible says. Like,
something else kind of weird to connect into is, if you were this perfect, beautiful, eternal being too, the whole idea of like imperfection, that it seems like God always chooses these people that are like the imperfect ones that give them the opportunity to try to redeem themselves. Talk about like a weird concept that I feel like the only person that would be able to conceptualize the idea of beauty within imperfection would be something that was a perfect being that could see those flaws as its own set of perfections in a weird way. Just a different philosophical line of thought. But the only way that imperfections would exist is because something perfect would want something different in order to create a new form of beauty.
Well, and there's this sense of, imperfections are this inevitability when you create creatures with free agency, right? So once you give a creature the ability to make decisions for itself, it can decide to do something less than perfect. And that's where you then end up with all these imperfections, right? Which is a really fascinating thing that, you know, I could spend a lot of time talking about.
But it creates beauty with imperfection, because at that point it's like,
oh, totally,
it's a new form of creation, which is why it makes it beautiful in the first place.
Mm-hmm. It's still beautiful. It's just a different,
because it's creation inspiring creation, essentially, if you really think about it.
Yeah, this is how the Bible starts out in Genesis 2. Like, I'm going to make mankind. Well, in Genesis 1, 2, I'm going to make mankind in my image. We're made in His image as creators with creative tendencies, with the capacity to love, with the capacity to appreciate beauty, to do all these things that He does, but in a limited form, whereas He, of course, is infinite, because by nature we're created. So if we're created, we're never going to be an infinite form of whatever those things are, which also means we have the capacity for failure. We're not infinite. We're not unchanging. You know, we're not perfect in that sense. So we naturally have the capacity for evil, for mistakes, for all those things. And there's still beauty in all of that, which is why, you know, what is it? It's Proverbs 8. I forget which verse. There's a verse where it says, wisdom still delights in humanity. And it's just been the children of men. And that stuck out to me because I was like, oh, the children of men. Mankind didn't have children until after the fall. So even after the fall, even after imperfection was introduced and you had sin enter the world, even then wisdom delighted in humanity. It's like, that's really cool. Like, that means there still is that beauty. Like, the beauty isn't lost. Evil was just added, right? So yeah, it's a really cool thing to think about. But
that forms another new form of beauty too, because then you have the idea of growth, which creates a new form of beauty. You have, the
redemption.
Yeah, and redemption, which again is creating yet another form of beauty in a weird way.
Yeah, and that makes sense, right? Like, you have this infinitely beautiful God. He creates something. It's only going to create perpetual beauty, right? But yeah, so with that concept, right, that really rocked my world. It was like, whoa. One, I had no idea that pagans had a concept of a singular creator, and then a pantheon that came afterwards. I was like, what? You know, it turns out there are a couple religions like that, or mythologies like that, however you want to refer to them, that do have that kind of like lesser known concept of well, there's the one unknown God that created everything else. We don't talk about him very often. And you're like, what? Why? But the Greeks did have this concept that he was unknowable, that he was beyond conception, that we can philosophize and we can kind of like try to pick at what he might be like, but because he's invisible and unseen and unknowable, we'll never really know. And the difference is with the biblical paradigm, it's like, guess what? No, actually, one, he used to be here. Like, he was walking around with Adam and Eve. He's actually very personable, and he very much wants to have a personal relationship with you. And that should be mind-boggling in and of itself. For me, it's still mind-boggling. Like, so you're this infinite creator, and you actually want to have a personal relationship with each individual human? Like, why? But then it makes sense because he's infinitely loving. So of course he would.
And why would you want to experience your own place you created too? It's almost like the concept of creating a video game and then not wanting to play it and just watching other people speculate and play it. It's like, if you create this beautiful thing, of course you want to get in on the groundwork of it and be able to see it and experience it and see the true beauty you created. So logically it would make sense that at some point, he would be here in form, seeing and experiencing what he created.
Exactly. And it's not that he needs to, it's that he wants to with everything, right? Why did he make everything? Because he felt like it. Mm-hmm. Well, why did he come down? Because he wanted to. Like, he does what he wants, man. Like, but it's it's a little facetious when I say that, but I think it's funny. But yeah, that concept of this infinite God and all those infinite aspects and attributes of him was really clicking, and I was like, okay, this actually makes a lot of sense. And it was really helpful for me to even as like for apologetics as a Christian to argue for there being a God. I'm like, that's one of the most airtight arguments I've ever heard for the existence of a singular creator. Like, Greek philosophers nailed it a long time ago. They were like, well, there has to be. Like, plain and simple, like, what are we talking about? Obviously, there had to be a first singular infinite God that's above all things and has infinite power and infinite knowledge and infinite everything, right? Like, I'm like, oh, okay. I didn't realize we solved this problem already a long time ago. But something that came to me more uniquely, I think it was last year, I was studying higher level math, and in higher level forms of math, they talk about infinity. And so this was kind of clicking with my head. I was like, oh, like, that's fine. Like, I've been reading about this concept of infinity and philosophy and how that connects with, God and Yahweh and all that stuff. And in infinity math, that's not what it's called, but like ZFC set theory would be the more like specific, term to use. But in this form of math, there was this aspect of infinity addition that kind of blew me away, because there's two really important concepts that we need to understand when talking about this, and I'll explain why this makes sense and why I'm talking about it. There's this concept in math specifically with sets, and a set is it's kind of what it sounds like. It's a set of things. It's a list of objects or whatever, right? And you can have different things in a set, but a set must have, if you're going to combine two sets, I could have a set that has different objects, let's say squares and triangles. But if I have one set with squares and triangles and one set with squares, they don't share what's referred to as cardinality. The cardinality is whether or not they contain the same things and or the same number of things. And so if things are off, you can't, if I have 3 items and I'm trying to add it to this list of 2 items, I don't get to just add it to the front or the back or whatever. If I'm trying to add this one plus this one and this one plus this one and that one plus that one, but there is no other one, right? The list is just a different length, then it doesn't work. It doesn't have cardinality. So that simply means this, like, okay, this set has this cardinality, this one has a different one, I can't add them together, plain and simple. If they have the same cardinality, I can do tons of stuff with them together. It's kind of like in school, if you ever heard the phrase, like, in order to compare or combine, they must be the same kind. That's kind of like a rhyme that I heard in school. It's like that, right? That's the concept of cardinality. This is, to me, is really cool when it just clicks at the end.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back after this brief commercial break. And now back to that deep conversation you crave.
But so you have this concept of cardinality. And then there's this other important concept that there are different types of infinity, right? So you can have this infinite, the best way we can represent infinity in math is as a set that just doesn't have an end, right? And so just infinite list of numbers, and you could define an infinite list of numbers as all natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, right? You just keep going. You just keep going, then it's an infinite set. So I have this infinite set, but that's one infinite set. Now I can have this other infinite set that's just a whole bunch of like rational numbers or integers, right? And so different numbers, different lists, different infinity. They're both infinity, right? I can add those things together, and I can actually add infinity plus this infinity. And if they're the same cardinality, then I can do that, right? Now I have, interestingly enough, one infinity with technically two infinities, but it's really only one infinity now. And this is where things get interesting, because not all infinities can be added together because of cardinality, but there is a specific equation. And this is not a thing. This is more of a concept that clicked in my head that I found to be this really interesting analogy for the Trinity. There's this thing called Aleph null, which is a specific type of infinity. It's called Aleph is actually it's a Hebrew letter, because in math we actually use Hebrew letters for infinity. I guess it's because we ran out of Greek symbols. But this Aleph null, you can actually write the equation out this way for it, and it would actually make mathematical sense. Like n plus z plus q equals Aleph null. Aleph null means it's that Aleph symbol, and then a little zero is like sub-zero right there. That's a specific type. I'm not going to get into how they have like the different types of Aleph and all that stuff, but just know that there's a specific type of infinity where you can have these three infinities: n representing all natural numbers, z representing, I believe that one's all integer numbers, and then q representing all rational numbers. Different infinities, different numbers. Now, what's interesting is some of those actually contain some of the same numbers. So there's a little bit of a Venn diagram. They overlap, but they're still unique. So three infinities, they're all infinite. They all have an infinite length. They have overlap with each other, but they also are unique. And you can add all of them together into a single infinity, Aleph null. This to me was like the most accurate analogy I've ever heard of for the Trinity, because you could be like, that doesn't make any sense. How can you have one God? How can you have plural singular, right? Or a singular plurality? How can you have one infinite God creator, but there are three Godheads, Father, Son, Holy Spirit? How could that possibly make sense? It's like, well, actually, mathematically, we have a way to model that. We have a way for that to make concrete sense. Like, you can have three infinite, unique, and overlapping forms of infinity, right? That are technically all one. In this case, Aleph null and the equation. They're all one, but there are three different, unique, and overlapping infinities all at the same time. They're distinct, and yet they're one. And they're one. The only reason they were able to be one is because they share cardinality. They're of the same type, which this connects with the kind of traditional definition of the Trinity, which is that they are unique in personhood, right? But they are one in essence. And so you could say that as like essence as being that cardinality, because they're of the same type. They're able to be in one form of infinity, even though they're three separate infinities, and they have unique roles, unique sets of numbers. In the same way that the Trinity has similarities, and yet there are differences. In Scripture alone, we have confirmation of this, where it's like, look, God cannot be tempted. James 1:13 says, God the Father cannot be tempted. But in Mark 1:13, it says that Jesus was tempted but did not sin. So hold on. How are you the same if God the Father cannot be tempted, but Jesus can be tempted? It's like, well, they have different roles. It's like, but then they're both described as being the ones that created the universe, right? You have Genesis 1, and then you have Colossians 1 and Hebrews 1, which both of those say that Jesus was actually the thing that everything was created through. So does John chapter 1. But what about Genesis 1 where it says it was God, right? Well, it was both. How could it possibly be both? Well, in the same way, how do you have three forms of infinity as one? Like, here's this overlap where they're both the creator, right? Here's this overlap where they're both like all powerful. And yet there can still be these distinct aspects that are different, where he can be tempted, the Father can't, right? Where Christ isn't necessarily omnipresent necessarily. He is, but that's only because it says the Spirit of the Son, which is the Holy Spirit. Again, like, how? I thought it was the same and different. Again, it's like, well, how do you have three infinities? They're all in one, right? Holy Spirit is omnipresent. And so in that sense, Jesus Christ is omnipresent, but he does have locality. He chooses to have this body, this glorified body, right? That he is limiting himself to. And so this is how you can have these, scriptures describing three Godheads, one God. They have unique attributes to themselves. Then they have shared attributes, and all of them are infinite, having no beginning and no end, and they're all the same God. Math actually makes that make sense, which for me, I was like, that's so cool, because for so long it was this like mind-boggling, how could I ever wrap my head around it? And it's not that I understand the mysteries of the Trinity, but I'm like, that does actually make sense. Now, maybe I did a bad job explaining. Please, let me know. But that's the concept that for me, it blew my mind.
I mean, honestly, when you were explaining that, it started connecting in with, I'm sure you're familiar with it, the Nokia Tesla 369 concept, that three separate numbers, but they could be this continuous pattern. Like, I'm curious if what you're explaining also plays a role into this whole 369 mystery that Nokia Tesla always talked about with if you only knew the magnificence of 3, 6, and 9, then you'd have the key to the universe, which kind of seems like it's kind of playing into what you're explaining.
Yeah, I never thought about that. Maybe. Yeah. Yeah, I'd have to sit and think.
Because like I said, there are three separate numbers, but they can all go together. 3, 6, 9, and it just goes up continuously. But again, they're all separate numbers. And then it goes into the fact that like one of them's even, one of them can be dispersed by the first number by 3, but then the one number by itself can't necessarily be divided down. Like, it seems like it kind of parallels the concept that you're explaining.
Yeah. That's an interesting one. Yeah. Yeah, I think there's tons of treasures and nuggets like that in math where, we think of it as this boring subject, but in reality, it has the potential to explain some of the most confusing and profound things in the universe. And there's a reason why our entire society is running off of numbers, right? Why, like,
people can be driven crazy by numbers. Like, people that have that whole concept that math works the specific way, and then they find that one problem that they can't figure out. Like, it can drive people to the point of madness off of having a basic understanding of this. So that just proves that there is aspects of the universe that are malleable and don't necessarily play by the rules that we're trying to set up from our human perspective.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's something to be said about how, because it is tapping into something that is just beyond what we can conceptualize. We can reach these problems even mathematically that we're like, oh, we know there must be a solution, and yet we, for the life of us, can't figure it out. I kind of love that. Like, I'm a big fan of enigmas. I think they're cool. And I think it's neat that math can actually be this concrete way to represent problems that some of which cannot be, like, we know enough to know we can't solve them. I think that's crazy. That's just a cool concept that we can concretely know that something is unsolvable, and yet people have lost their minds trying to solve it anyway, which is just kind of this irrational human thing to do, right? It's like, but no, we already know we can't solve it. Like, no, there must be a way. Like, no, we really can't. So it's interesting. I think it strikes a very deep chord with humanity.
See, and that goes into a lot of the stuff that we were talking about a bit earlier. Like, when you have this framework of this is how things work, and then somebody throws something in that completely shatters that paradigm, it's like you completely just try to rationalize it to completely get it to fit back into your set of rules, which is exactly what we see with some of these old writings and things, is that, people are set to, this is the rules, this is how things work, this is what things are. And then they have something that comes out different, and it drives them to the point where it's either they go crazy or they just pretend like it doesn't exist in the first place. And again, it's this continuous thing that you see through everything.
Yeah, no, it's true. And that's why, I like how our conversation has been able to flow into these different avenues, because, knowledge really is a body, right? There are tons of different parts and pieces to it. They're different, but they all work together. And this is why I enjoy taking time to slow down and think about things philosophically, think about things scientifically, think about it linguistically, think about it mathematically, because all of these different avenues are part of what give us those eureka moments or those breakthroughs, or even just simply, what is that?
Book on paradoxes. This is like,
there we go.
Exactly the stuff I dive into, because I feel like there's a lot of these things are like metaphors for other things. Like they seem like they're these unsolvable equations, but realistically they're a translation of something else that we can't quite place or describe yet, or that we have no paradigm for, and it doesn't make sense to us because we don't understand this broader concept that whatever this paradox is a piece of.
Well, it makes sense when we sit back and, let me finish my point real quick before I go down that rabbit trail. That the reason why this is beneficial is because, like we're saying, everything is connected. And because everything is connected, if I'm at a roadblock with some specific problem, I'm trying to go this way, just hit my mic, and I try to go this way, if I take time and slow down and meditate and think of other things, I can oftentimes get around it just by using a different avenue that I wouldn't have thought of if I hadn't, looked at it from a completely different, mindset. If I'm looking at something linguistic and I take a scientific approach, maybe I'm able to solve that, right? Different methodologies and ways of thinking, or even just being able to balance back and forth between. There's a dance that you want to do with productive thinking between convergent and divergent thinking, right? Convergent being that more what we think of like left brain, step by step, purely logical side, versus the divergent, insert a little bit of chaos, let what flows into your mind flow into your mind. Let me try this crazy thing that probably won't work, right? You have that divergent thinking, that convergent thinking. And the best form of investigation, philosophy, productivity, is knowing the rhythm to switch between those things. That's what I found in life, is like when you find the right rhythm, everything fits into place. Okay, I'm a little bit stuck. I'm going to switch over to divergent thinking. I'm going to be a little crazy. I'm going to say, what about this? What about that? Throw stuff, see what sticks. Something sticks. I'm going to switch over into convergent thinking, and I'm going to drill in and see what's going on and understand it. Okay, I've exhausted what I can here. Okay, I'm going to switch back. And then it just keep going back and forth. And when you do that, like, it's wild how quickly things move, how productive you become, and how deeply you start to understand things, right?
Inquiries About Reality will return after this quick commercial break. And we are back, so let's hop right in. Dude, you want to talk about like weirdness with that? I mean, that's honestly the way I go about bizarre encounters most of the time. And a lot of the time on this show, where we had like a recent episode where we were talking about the Cisco Grove UFO encounter. And originally it starts off, seeming like it's this typical like UFO encounter. You're throwing these like crazy ideas, these crazy like everything at the wall. But then, the way that I usually go about stuff is I'll throw these crazy things and I'll throw these logical things. And then I'll kind of bring it into this point at the end. And it's funny that it's like with a lot of this, exploring a lot of this weird stuff, you have to throw out the crazy theories to try to make it so the logical ones start to at least make a little bit more sense. It's that typical motif that you hear in the community that you have to be an open-minded skeptic, where it's like by the end of that episode, we got to the fact that we were pretty sure that it was just some type of like human intervention. But if it wasn't for the fact that we threw out the crazy ideas first and at least just put them out in the open so that they were something that was at least discussed, we wouldn't have gotten back to that rational point. It's kind of like you have to throw out the crazy end of the spectrum so you can rationalize why it's not that, so you can pull it back to the rational side of the spectrum and find that spot in the middle, because you don't want to hit the overly rational point where you're explaining something to the point where you're getting rid of any type of mystery that might be involved with it by strictly going through rational thinking. And then you also don't want to go right off into the open-minded thinking where, every single bump in the night is something that's, on the other side of the spiritual realm. Like you start off on both ends of the spectrum and just find this even spot in the middle, from the most logical to the most crazy, and then you just even it out.
Yeah, this is making me think of the flood narrative, because when we see creation, it starts off with God hovering over the surface of these chaos waters, right? These chaotic waters. And almost every ancient cosmology has this concept of these primordial chaos waters, whether they're neutral or stagnant, or whether they're a goddess or something like that. There's always some kind of form of that. And in the Genesis account of that, these are these chaotic waters, and they're just waters. And God takes this chaos and brings about order. And that's what Genesis 1 is about. And then he creates humanity. Humanity, things go south. The world gets to this insanely wicked point, and he has to restart. How does he solve the problem? He brings floodwaters back. Like, he brings back the chaos. Like we're talking about the divergent thing. Like, back comes the chaos, restart, and then there are all these parallels. You can look at the verses and see how they parallel Genesis 1, where now he's yet again, here's all the chaos waters, and then God's going to bring back order. The waters recede, and it's almost like a creative, a creation motif all over again. So it's kind of cool. Even God solves problems by using, inserting chaos at the right moment, and then solving the problem of chaos with order. And it's not to, it's not just for the sake of doing it. Like, he did it deliberately and for a reason, because he had to. And that's the difference, right? If I'm just chaotic for the sake of being chaotic, well, I'm not helping with my own investigation. I'm just making a mess, right? But when it's intentional, it's like that intentional, surgical, precision of chaos. I'm like,
it's like good cop, bad cop during an interrogation. That's probably a pretty good example. You got to have the chaotic, and then you have the rational to even somebody back out.
Right. And you can do that poorly. Like, you can do good cop, bad cop poorly. So it's like, okay, yeah, I can do too much good cop, or I can do too much bad cop, but it's like knowing the right amount. And that's that, that thing that I found is to really be the trick, is like, okay, even God does it, but he does it. Of course, he does it perfectly, but like
strategic chaos.
He does it with, it's strategic. It's intentional. And that's where I'm like, okay, that is, I think, a more healthy way of viewing chaos. Chaos is not inherently bad. It's actually a very useful tool when you understand what it is and how to use it. So I don't know how we got on that, but
I mean, bringing it around full circle with that one, you talk about like the 10 Commandments, and when he originally first came down and everybody was going absolutely crazy. I mean, that could have been intentionally placed chaos, because, people may not have actually sat and listened to the words unless there was chaos going on, and he was able to say, these are the rules that we need to live by. So even that, weirdly enough, could have been intentional chaos in order to solidify the point of this is the rules and regulations from now on.
Well, it almost makes me think of Romans, right, where Paul is talking about the role of the law and how it like exposes the chaos of humanity, right, where it's exposing the sins that exist. It's kind of like that is the convergence, exposing the divergence, and then exposing the fact that even under the law there was no under the law alone there was no salvation in that. Of course, it's like the solution is Jesus. But yeah, it's interesting, right? Like, yeah, I think there's an aspect of it.
But I guess kind of starting to wrap up this 0.5 conversation, because I've already said we're going to run around about an hour. I know that there's a couple other concepts that you want to get into, but I know that we could probably save those for some future episodes, because I always want a new excuse to be able to talk to you, man, because we always get into these really deeply philosophical conversations, and these are always like my absolute favorite, man. So I got to tell you straight up, man, you're one of my favorite people to have on the show just because of how deep these conversations go. So I'm going to look for any excuse to continuously keep having you back on so we can keep having these deep conversations, man, because that's why I started the show in the first place, was the ability to be able to have these conversations, because you don't get these a lot of the time in the real world unless you find certain niche people, but thanks to the internet we're able to do these types of things with somebody that's halfway across the country.
Yeah, well, I'm flattered. I really do appreciate that, and I really enjoy our conversations too. You're definitely toward the top of the list of fun podcast hosts to talk to, so right back at you.
Well, that means a lot, man. Coming from my end, that definitely means a lot. So, I guess starting to wrap up completely towards the end. For anybody that may not have listened to the original episode, which again seems completely crazy because it seems like you'd miss a lot of the context for this, or if they just didn't look up your information beforehand, why don't you let everybody know again where they might be able to find you at on the internet?
Yeah, so projecteleazar.com. That's where you'll find my articles, links to resources, citations, links to the other podcasts I've been on, any contact information, social media, all that stuff you can find on my website, projecteleazar.com. And if you got questions, feel free to reach out. I'll do my best to reply when I can, because I do get a lot of emails. But feel free to.
Well, man, I really appreciate you spending the first hour with me for the main show and then spending another hour with me for this extra conversation. Definitely means a lot, especially considering this is only the second of these extended conversations. And that's exactly why it's going to end up being public, is because this was such a great conversation, man. I want to give people a feed for what's going on in the background, and everything that you said, man, is definitely stuff that needs to get out. So, again, I appreciate you making the time to come on. I appreciate you doing this after show with me, and I'm really looking forward to next